One is a caveat, and I'm obliged to speak out this caveat. I'm here in my personal capacity, so the views I express here are not necessarily the views that are shared by the MOD or the government. And since today we have a government, so I can say this. So this is a caveat. I'm here in my personal capacity, so whatever I say, those are my own views. A lot of what's being said in the morning sessions and also this afternoon, well, I can see a lot of problems that are common to all operations. But of course, it is quite difficult to extrapolate from one theater into another theater and compare and extrapolate the solutions that are proposed from one theater of operation to another one. And one has to remind always that each operation has to be treated on a case-by-case basis. And whatever the solution is, it can work in Operation A, but it doesn't necessarily work in Operation B and C. And that was definitely one of the lessons learned from the operations in Afghanistan and Unified Protector on Libya. For the aircrew who flew in Afghanistan previously and who were tasked to fly over Libya to implement UN Security Council Resolution 1973, what we saw is that they were still in the mindset of Afghanistan while they were supposed to adapt to the necessities for executing air operations in the context of Operation Unified Protector. And there again we had to emphasize and re-emphasize also for the pilots who flew in Operation Unified Protector and who were earmarked to fly in Afghanistan a couple of months later, we have to insist that what works for Operation Unified Protector works in OUP, but it doesn't work necessarily in Afghanistan and the other way around. And basically, this is a logical consequence based on the fact that the surrounding conditions in which both operations work and in which air crews have to operate in this distinct environment are totally different. And it starts with the strategic environment. If you look at the ISAF operation in Afghanistan, well, what are the strategic objectives, as was said previously this morning, where distinction was made between the strategic objectives and the tactical objectives. And I can only emphasize and re-emphasize the importance of making that distinguish and never lose sight of those strategic objectives. Well, in Afghanistan, it's to create a secure and stable environment on the one hand. In Unified Protector, well, your strategic objectives was or were the protection of the civilians and civilian populated areas under attack or threat of attack by the Libyan armed forces and associated forces. I will come back later on that to see to what extent and what were the difficulties when engaging individuals and mercenaries who, on an individual or an organized base, were assisting the Libyan authorities in suppressing the civilians, mainly in the eastern part of Libya, and how we reacted on that by our air operations. And the importance of the strategic objectives is not purely academic. The importance of those strategic objectives are important because they are reflected in the soldier's card and in the rules of engagement, which basically are the translation of the strategic objectives on a military strategic and military political level into the operational and the tactical level. And that's quite important because those strategic objectives for the operator, it's quite clear. They are translated into a military end state, where you will define your decisive points in your operational planning process. But in order to achieve those decisive points, you will need accurate rules of engagement which allow you to perform the operations in accordance with the mandate and to achieve finally at the end of the day or at the end of the armed conflict, must I say, the strategic objectives which were set forth as far as we are concerned in OUP on the one hand and ISAF, which were laid down in the UN Security Council resolutions. Another distinction, especially when you compare Afghanistan to OUP in Libya, is that, of course, whereas ISAF was concerned, we had boots on the grounds. So basically, if you have to lead your aircraft to a military objective and to prosecute that military objective, if you have a JTAC, a Joint Terminal Attack Controller, which can help you and lead the aircraft to prosecute within the limits of the law of armed conflict a military objective and to strike that military objective, that was not the case as far as the operations in Libya were concerned. We had no boots on the ground. And even if the UN Security Council resolution did not prohibit the sending of ground forces, with the sole exception that there was the prohibition of having an occupying force partially or totally on the territory of Libya, we did not send JTACs or forward air controllers to the ground. So basically that means that if your air assets don't have the accurate sensors in order basically to replace what you have as a JTAC when you have boots on the ground, makes of course a difference in the way you will strike and organize your targeting process, especially the dynamic targeting process. Another difference between the two operations is that, well, basically ISAF in Afghanistan is, everybody knows, it's asymmetric warfare. You're fighting a non-state actor which refuses deliberately to comply with the law of armed conflict, which is basically a counterinsurgency operations, and you have to adapt your means and methods in combating those non-state actors to achieve the final objective, which was basically not the case, at least not in the beginning of Operation Unified Protector. When we started operations on and against the Libyan armed forces, well, basically this was an interstate war according to the traditional principles of warfare between two or more states. But then apparently the Libyan armed forces changed their tactics and their strategy from what was traditional warfare to irregular warfare, not wearing uniforms anymore, using technicals which we were hardly able to distinguish from civilian vehicles, not wearing their uniforms anymore, which made it much more difficult for us to distinguish between them, mercenaries, and other individuals affiliated with Libyan armed forces on the one hand, and the civilian population on the other hand. The missions that were flew in Libya were also totally different from the missions we flew in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was basically close air support. What we did in Libya was basically going from DCA to OCA missions, from defensive counter-air to offensive counter-air missions. And that has, of course, an impact on the way your targeting process is organized. ISAF was basically a dynamic targeting issue, while in Operation Unified Protector, which was at least starting at the 1st of April this year, was a NATO operation and a coalition of the willing between the 19th of March, if my memory is good, and the 1st of April was a coalition of the willing, was mostly based on deliberate targeting. But I will come back later on the issues, the legal issues and the operational issues that were involved in dynamically and or deliberately targeting Libyan armed forces and associated individuals and material. But aircrew, each time, again and again, we had to emphasize the distinction between all of them because the ROEs are not the same, because the strategic environment is not the same, and because the enemy was not the same. And you need to be aware of those differences, because otherwise you're applying the wrong standards, the wrong ROEs in the wrong conflict. So the outline of my briefing will be as follows. So I will share with you some elements from the mandate, because basically there was an influence from the mandate which was given to the international community in UN Security Council Resolution 1973, and the impact on the use in bello, and to see to what extent there was an interrelation between the conditions under which we could enforce a no-fly zone and the embargo on the one hand, and on the other hand, the protection of the civilians and the civilian population as a use ad bellum. As I said previously, the strategic objective was the protection of the civilian population and civilian populated areas under attack or threat of attack. And the question that arose between not only legal advisors but also on a national basis was to understand, is this a limiting factor only on the use ad bellum, in a sense that we know that strategically the end state is to have the civilian population in Libya free from attacks and threats of attacks from the Libyan armed forces? Or do we, when we apply lethal kinetic force in our airstrikes, is there the necessity to have a direct and causal link between the military objectives we are going to strike in Libya and the protection of the civilian population? So basically, do I need each time I strike a particular target, do I need this direct link with the protection of the civilian population, or is this only related to the overall strategic objective and the end state which was mentioned in the UN Security Council resolution? So we will come back on this a little later on. So basically the mandate that was given to us was the mandate from UN Security Council Resolution 1973. So basically there were three main objectives. The first one was the protection of civilians and civilian populated areas under attack or threat of attack, excluding a foreign occupation force. But since there were no boots on the ground, that problem was a non-issue. Enforcing the no-fly zone. But there again, there was not necessarily a direct link with the protection of the civilian population. And once again, in practice, it is not always that easy to make a difference in a kinetic engagement. To what extent are we dealing under the no-fly zone operative paragraph of UN Security Council Resolution 1973, or is this an engagement under the protection of the civilians and the civilian populated areas? And then, of course, we had the embargo. What I like to emphasize anyway, because during other presentations and other fora, apparently some of the participants and lecturers apparently considered that NATO was there to support the fight of the insurgents or the rebels against the forces of Colonel Gaddafi. This was definitely not the case. Okay? The mandate was clear. We were there to protect the civilians and the civilian population. Yes, was there an indirect effect of some of our engagement which could benefit the rebels in their internal armed conflict against the regime forces? Definitely yes. Was that a support, deliberately supporting the rebels in their fight against the regime forces? No. So basically this was not as far as the NATO nations involved in that operation were concerned. This was definitely not an internationalized internal armed conflict. So basically, from a legal point of view, there were two armed conflicts on the territory of Libya. On the one hand, a non-international armed conflict between the rebels and the regime forces. And on the other hand, when UN Security Council Resolution 1973 was implemented by NATO starting the 1st of April this year, there was an international armed conflict between the NATO-led countries on the one hand and the Libyan armed forces on the other hand. So basically we had the coexistence of two different armed conflicts, and in no way did we, from NATO side or from the nations involved in that NATO operations, consider ourselves as being involved in an internationalized, non-international armed conflict. And the reason for that is, of course, also important, and in a sense that when we discussed some of the targeting issues, it was quite clear for us that we would execute the mandate in an impartial way, meaning that if there was a possibility, even hypothetical, that the rebels would attack the civilians or civilian populated areas, well, it was clear that the mandate which was given to us by the UN Security Council resolution was broadly enough to engage rebel forces as well, provided they would have been attacking or threatened to attack the civilian population. The second element which confirms again that we were not there in support of the rebels is the fact that we gave the opportunity to the Gaddafi forces to retreat and making a formal promise that if they were retreating and getting back to the barracks, that we would stop the intervention against the forces of Colonel Gaddafi, and that if they would comply with that condition and they would have been attacked, which was not the case because they never answered positively on this request, but supposing they returned to their barracks and they would have been attacked by the rebels, it was clear for the nations of the coalition that in no way would we would intervene in the right of self-defense from the regime forces against the rebels in the non-international armed conflict which was waging in Libya. So basically we had, as far as the legal framework is concerned, two different legal regimes, the rebels and the regime forces regulated by the law of non-international armed conflict, and on the other hand, at least till the fall of the regime of Colonel Gaddafi, there was an international armed conflict between the different nations of the coalition and the regime forces of Colonel Gaddafi. And then afterwards, of course, and that was also the case in Afghanistan, once Karzai was the official was taking office in Kabul, the international armed conflict turned into a non-international armed conflict when the National Transitional Council took over the governmental authorities from the Gaddafi regime in Tripoli. But from a targeting purpose, that made no difference as far as the dynamic or deliberate targeting issues were involved. So basically, we continue to apply our obligations under the law of international armed conflict, even knowing that from a legal point of view, the situation evolved from an NIAC to a NIAC. But that's only for operational reasons and not for legal reasons. So there is no legal consequence in the sense that even in that context we would have been obliged to apply the rules of international armed conflict in the context of a non-international armed conflict. So from a targeting point of view, which is probably the most interesting part, well, basically there were two issues. We had the deliberate targeting and we had the dynamic targeting part. And of course, we were dealing with some issues such as, well, some of them have been raised previously. What are we going to do with human shields, voluntary and non-voluntary human shields? What about snipers on top of roofs? Can we engage them? Can't we engage them? What about mercenaries? Can we engage them? Can't we engage them? What about persons who participate directly in hostilities without being a member of the Gaddafi armed forces? Can we engage them? Can't we engage them? So those were the issues we dealt with. Another one of the issues, and I come back on the legal framework again, as I said previously, it was clear for us that the legal framework was an international armed conflict where the law of international armed conflict applies, which is basically customary international law, the Geneva Conventions, and for those nations, especially mine, which is bound by the provisions of Additional Protocol 1, we applied, of course, the relevant provisions of AP1 during our targeting processes and during planning and execution of those air operations. The issue of human rights in armed conflict, as it has been stated previously, well, basically, we do have a little problem with human rights in that kind of conflicts. Why? Because we disagree on the fact that there can be an intrusion of human rights law within the targeting process. I mean, in the conduct of hostilities, when you are engaged in an international armed conflict, the lex specialis is the law of armed conflict, and you apply the law of armed conflict. And the law of armed conflict in the conduct of hostilities and in who you can target and who you can't target is quite clear. So basically, if you apply the standards of LOAC, you're on the fair side. And the kill and capture versus the obligation to capture your enemy combatant in an international armed conflict, which is one of those theses of human rights proponents and who like to integrate that into the context of LOAC. Well, we disagreed on that aspect. I mean, as far as your enemy combatant is not hors de combat, he remains a legitimate target on a 24/7 basis for the entire duration of the armed conflict. The second issue that was a difficult issue, which was a practical issue, was the issue of mercenaries and other persons who participate directly in hostilities. And we read also and we analyzed the interpretive guidance on the concept of direct participation in hostilities. But from an IHL point of view, if you are a member of an organized armed group and you participate in hostilities, well, then again, you are a legitimate military objective. And we agree with the guidance in the sense that organized armed groups acting as the armed forces of a non-state actors, that they are legitimate military objectives for the duration of the conflict. What we disagree with the study is that only insofar as they have a continuous combat function, you can target those individuals. If you are a member of an organized armed group, whether you have a combat support, combat service support function, if you are a member of an organized armed group, and once again, don't cite me on behalf of my government, if you are a member of such an organized armed group and you are involved in hostilities, in the conduct of hostilities, well, there again, you are a legitimate military objective on a 24-7 basis for the entire duration of the conflict, unless you become hors de combat. And that was also the way we interpreted the way, or at least the engagement of mercenaries and other individuals that were engaged in Operation Unified Protector, and to know to what extent we could only engage those individuals when they were directly participating in hostilities, in a sense that they were attacking the civilian population, or could we also attack those individuals or those groups when they were at specific staging points, knowing that they were at that point not attacking directly the civilian population, although there was a threat of attack to the civilian population. Well, even then, we agreed that the targeting of those individuals would not have been a violation of IHL in the conduct of operations. The problem we had with Operation Unified, the practical problem with Operation Unified Protector was basically that we had some difficulties to follow the scheme of maneuver in the deliberate part of the targeting process. Because once the war started, well, the key missions were essentially to enforce the no-fly zone, which was an easy one, in order to gain air superiority, which we had quite fast, prevent attacks on civilian areas and civilian populated areas as well. And having the ability to paralyze the Libyan Air Force and the systematic suppression of enemy air defense, which we did quite rapidly. But the ability to rapidly target and retarget proved to be crucial to achieve our mission objectives, because basically the deliberate targeting process is the classic one. I mean, you're planning on day X for the ATO of X+2. So your targeting cycle is on a 72 hours basis. But the problem was that during Operation Unified Protector, things were moving so fast that even after 24 hours, the targets that were on the PITL, on the prioritized target list for the ATO of X+2, well, basically the events went too fast in order to be able to follow operationally with a normal targeting process. So basically we had to adapt the deliberate targeting process and to fasten the deliberate targeting process in a sense that we were able to prosecute targets on the PITL on day X itself, which was not always easy to achieve, especially if you have your target folders, let's say 5 or 10 minutes, even in the best of cases, 30 minutes before the start of the JITWIC, which is your Joint Targeting Working Group. It's quite a challenge for your red card holder to keep pace with the evolution and making up his assessment to what extent he could engage Libyan armed forces in that process. So how was the operation organized on C2 level? Well, the Joint Force Commander was General Bouchard, who was at Naples. The CFAC, the Air Component Commander, was General Jodis, a 3-star US general who was initially based in Izmir, but who rapidly came to the KEOK, where on a tactical level all the air operations were planned in order to execute the air missions which were provided or scheduled at least on the ATO. And then you had the different units which were tasked to execute those different missions. So what happened was that in a normal cycle we had a JITWIC on day X which was generally planned on 1400 hours. You had the Joint Coordination Board, which was planned the same day at 1800s, but in a regular ATO cycle, those targets which were elected by the Joint Coordination Board, or at least which were proposed to the COM and the DCOM for prosecution, generally you would prosecute those targets 72 hours later, which was problematic in that operation. So basically the first step was to reduce the planning process from 72 hours to 24 hours. But even then, we were dealing with the fact that some of the targets didn't have any sense operationally to strike them anymore. So we had to go even faster, which was, of course, for the red card holders of the different nations problematic, because basically what you had was your JITWIC still at 1400 of day X. You had the Joint Coordination Board at 1800 of the same day, and the targets to be prosecuted in a deliberate way were to be prosecuted at 2000 hours of the same day. But if you have your target folders at the same day, 5 or 10 minutes prior to the JITWIC, and you have to assess to what extent intel is sufficient in order to target or to prosecute target A, B, or C, well, I can assure you that even as a legal advisor, if you don't have immediate access to the Five Eyes community target folders, it's a hell of a job to help your red card holder in order to assess, is this still a legitimate military target that we can prosecute with our national means within the targeting process of Operation Unified Protector. So that was basically what we called the dynamic deliberate targeting process, in the sense that the targeting process as such was dynamic anyway. And one of the crucial elements then was basically ISR. I mean, intel was crucial to prosecute some of the targets that were proposed on the PITL, especially the live feed. CIFCAS was also one of the major concerns. Generally, NATO accepted a no CIFCAS policy, which made it, of course, quite difficult in some circumstances, especially if you have to operate without JTACs, without forward air controllers in Tripoli and other build-up areas. It is clear that we needed to find other solutions, delaying wherever possible, or even not engaging the target in order to comply with this non-CIFCAS policy, which was a NATO policy. Some of the issues we had as well were, of course, police stations, mercenaries, human shields. But there again, I think that everything has been said previously. The military objectives and the legal assessments on targeting those military objectives are clear. Human shields, well, there again, the never-ending story, to what extent, when you have voluntary human shields, to what extent you can attack voluntary human shields. There is, as was said by Dr. Knut Dorman in his briefing as well, basically you have two opposing dilemmas, whether you consider them as civilians all the way around, and there is a prohibition in attacking those individuals which remain civilians anyway, or you consider that this is DPH, and basically you can attack them in the same way as you would attack and prosecute the military objective they're trying to shield. The middle way is probably, from a result point of view, the same as the last one, is to consider that civilians who voluntarily are shielding military objectives from attack, to the extent that they don't become military objectives themselves, you should not count them into the proportionality analysis, which is basically more of a method, but the result basically is the same. You would still be allowed to attack the military objective, and you would not take into consideration in your proportionality analysis the voluntary human shield. So basically there are three different ways in which you can analyze the possibility of prosecuting human shields. From our point of view, we would probably go for the DPH as well, in the sense that human shields civilians who give up deliberately their immunity to shield military objectives from attack are directly participating in hostilities, and for the time as they participate directly in hostilities would lose their immunity from attack. As far as members of organized armed groups are concerned, mercenaries included, as I said previously, especially if they are members of organized armed groups, there again, we consider that the continuous combat function criterion as such is not the good criterion. Members of organized armed groups engaging in an armed conflict in the conduct of hostilities, well, there again, they remain a legitimate military objective for the duration of the armed conflict. And then the last point, which was and is still controversial, is what's the place of human rights in the law of armed conflict? Well, there again, in the conduct of hostilities, and we understand that in whereas detention issues is concerned, and whereas the law of armed conflict doesn't provide a sufficient answer, and there may be a lacuna in the law of armed conflict, human rights can jump in and fill the gap of the LOAC, whereas the LOAC doesn't provide sufficient guarantees in order to deal with detention operations or detainee operations. But whereas the conduct of hostilities is concerned, it is at least my assumption that the law of armed conflict is clear. As far as the principle of distinction is concerned, as far as the principle of proportionality is concerned, and that there is no place for human rights in the conduct of hostilities, not on kill and capture, and the obligation. There is no legal obligation in the law of armed conflict to capture an enemy combatant. An enemy combatant, by definition, is a legitimate military objective for 24 hours a day for the entire duration of the conflict, unless he becomes hors de combat. And there is no need to deviate from that strict rule of LOAC to import the rule of human rights law, which was never designed to deal with those issues anyway. And even on proportionality, I think the proportionality rule in LOAC is quite clear. If you import human rights law within the law of armed conflict during armed conflicts, well, you have to be aware that the proportionality analysis under human rights law is totally different from the proportionality as we have it in AP1. The proportionality analysis in human rights law is a strict proportionality analysis in the framework of the life to right provisions, which can be found back in the different regional human rights conventions, such as the European Convention on Human Rights. And it was stated previously by one of the lecturers that, well, on Grozny and Russia, what about those situations? Well, the European Court of Human Rights addressed some of the issues of human rights, or at least of the intervention of the Russian armed forces in Chechnya. But there again, I'm not such a fan, as you will probably have noticed, of this human rights issue in armed conflicts, and that is also something we have to remember as Europeans, because we have to deal on a daily basis with the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, even in military operations, taking into consideration the Bankovic case, taking into consideration the Isajeva case, and other cases where the European Court analyzed law of armed conflict issues in the context of a human rights context, and where they try to, well, to shrink and to apply basically IHL provisions, and try to see to what extent they could apply IHL provisions within the provisions of human rights under the Article 2 and the right to life provision. And basically you can almost feel that there is something going fundamentally wrong with having a European Court on Human Rights, which basically was not instaured to consider those kind of issues, and trying to implement the precautions from Article 57. If you look at the Isajeva case, where convoys were attacked by airplanes of the Russian Air Force, and where the court is struggling with its own convention to see how it can apply human rights convention in a situation of armed conflict, which is problematic for us in the sense that the European Court of Human Rights should stick to its essential mission, which is the safeguarding of human rights in a human rights context. And there again, I can understand that in a situation of peace or an emergency situation, yes, the right of life provision applies, and the court has to apply those provisions and to interpret those provisions within a human rights context. If the court is dealing with an IHL issue in the context of an armed conflict, well, there again, in the conduct of hostilities, there is no place, even under Article 2 and the right to life provision, to twist the IHL provisions in a sense, well, in a way that make no sense at the end of the day. And that's why I'm not so fond of this human rights introduction, or at least from proponents of human rights, to introduce those principles and rules within the context of LOAC. The LOAC is clear, and certainly as far as the conduct of hostilities is concerned. So what were basically the lessons learned from Operation Unified Protector? Well, basically that the mandate should be clear enough in order not to have any doubt for the operators to know what they can and can't do in the context of an armed conflict. Of course, that's also one of the tasks of the legal advisors, to assist the operational guys in order to interpret and to translate those mandates and those ROEs within basic rules which they can apply in day-to-day operations. Pilots are not supposed to well, they're supposed to understand, but I mean, you have to give them clear instructions as what they can do and what they can't do in the targeting process. And there again, as was said previously as well, in dynamic targeting, what you do is probably according to the level of civilian damage or collateral damage that may be the consequence of prosecuting a particular target. The higher the collateral damage, the higher your target engagement authority will be. So in order to protect your pilots against prosecution for whatever they did or did not do during such an operation, basically what you do is you restrict the discretion of your pilots to a CDE level 1 and 2, and all the other issues will be dealt with within the CAOC. And that's basically what was done during Operation Unified Protector as well. In dynamic and in deliberate targeting, if the level of collateral damage exceeded the level 1 and 2, which is quite basic level in the sense that there are no nearest collateral concerns within the weapon effect range of your GBU 12 and 38. If it exceeds that collateral damage, all decisions were taken within the CAOC. Because in the CAOC, we were able to assess collateral damage. We were able, with the live feed we had from our US allies, to make a very quick assessment to what extent targeting and prosecuting a particular target was still within the limits of the law of armed conflict. But then again, intel proved to be crucial in the prosecution of targets. UAVs, which we had at our disposal from different nations, proved to be crucial, especially when high-value targets and C2 nodes in urban areas were concerned. So this concludes basically my brief on Operation Unified Protector and the challenges of the LOAC within that context. Thank you.